Pay attention to the man in this footage. Look at the way he's standing, calm, almost proud. He's in what appears to be a large enclosed workshop, fluorescent lighting overhead, industrial ventilation panels visible along the upper wall, the kind of space that's been custom built for something that doesn't belong in a normal house. And wrapped around him, draped over his shoulders, coiled across his chest, its body as thick as a man's thigh, is one of the largest snakes you have ever seen in your life. It's a reticulated python, yellow phase. The scales are luminous, gold and black, with that subtle iridescent shimmer that makes them look almost unreal under artificial light. The snake is easily 20 feet long, maybe more. Its head rests somewhere off camera, but the coils visible in this footage alone are extraordinary. The weight of this animal, the sheer physical mass of it, is hard to comprehend until you realize that those coils, wrapped as they are around a human torso, represent enough constriction force to stop a grown man's heart in minutes. The man holding it doesn't flinch, doesn't adjust his grip. He stares directly at whoever is filming, expression completely blank. Not excited, not nervous, not proud in any warm or relatable way. Just present, still. Like the snake and the man are two parts of the same cold, patient machine. This footage was taken by someone who knew him. Someone who was, at the time, standing just a few feet away in that same workshop. Someone who thought they were there for a business meeting. That person would be dead within 72 hours. And that snake, that beautiful, terrifying 22-foot animal, is the reason this case almost went completely unsolved. Because when a man disappears and leaves no body, no blood, no evidence of violence, investigators have almost nothing to work with. Almost. Almost. You know that feeling when you think you know someone? When you've worked side by side with a person for years, sat across the desk from them in meetings, split lunches with them, watched them shake hands with clients and close deals and handle pressure, and you genuinely believe down in your gut that you understand who they are? For Marcus Hale, that feeling was his last mistake. Marcus was 41 years old, and by every account from everyone who knew him, a genuinely good person. Not perfect, not without his flaws, but the kind of good that shows up in the day-to-day fabric of a life, the way he coached his son's little league team every weekend even when work got overwhelming, how he'd drive an hour each way to the field and stand in the Tennessee heat cheering for kids who weren't even all that good at baseball, because it mattered to his son, and therefore it mattered to him. His name was Marcus Allen Hale. He grew up in the Mid-South, the second of 3 kids in a family that didn't have much money but had a lot of work ethic. He dropped out of community college at 20, not because he wasn't capable, but because he couldn't afford to keep going and the work was there, so he took it. Loading docks first, then warehouse logistics, then freight routing. He spent years developing a deep, practical understanding of the import-export process, the paperwork, the regulations, the customs protocols, the international freight systems, from the ground level up, which is the kind of knowledge that can't be taught in a classroom. By his mid-30s, he'd turned that knowledge into a small consulting business. Nothing glamorous. He helped small and mid-sized companies navigate international shipping compliance, customs documentation, freight manifests, import permits, the kind of regulatory labyrinth that costs businesses real money when they get it wrong. He had 3 full-time employees, a modest office in a low-key commercial building on the north side of Clarksville, Tennessee, and a client list that was steady, if not spectacular. He drove a used pickup truck and took 1 vacation a year and coached Little League. He was content. He was proud of what he'd built, and he was, for the first time in his adult life, financially stable enough that he could breathe. He lived in a quiet subdivision with his wife, Renata, and their son, Owen, who was 14 years old. Neighbors on that street described the family as warm, normal, thoroughly unremarkable in the best possible sense. Marcus would wave from the driveway. Renata brought food to new neighbors when they moved in. Owen mowed the lawn. It was, by all appearances, exactly what it looked like. A family doing fine. The problem, the thing Marcus didn't fully understand until it was far too late to do anything safe with the knowledge, was who he'd chosen to build his business with. His business partner's name was Daniel Forsyth, and Daniel Forsyth was not the man Marcus Hale believed him to be. Daniel Forsyth was 36 years old when Marcus disappeared, and on paper, he was impressive. He'd come into the business partnership about 5 years earlier, around 2002, bringing with him an established network of overseas logistics contacts and what appeared to be a genuine facility for the technical side of international trade. He was articulate in client meetings, meticulous with documentation, at least the documentation clients were supposed to see. And he had a kind of calm, measured authority in professional settings that Marcus had initially found reassuring. What Daniel brought to the business in those early years was real. His international connections opened doors for their consulting practice that Marcus couldn't have reached alone. He knew the right people in the right ports. He understood customs clearance procedures in jurisdictions where Marcus's knowledge stopped, and he worked hard, or appeared to. The hours he kept were long. The deals he closed were good. For the first 2 or 3 years, everything seemed to function exactly as advertised. Off the clock, though, Daniel's life was something else entirely. He lived alone on a rural property about 11 miles from downtown Clarksville, a place accessed by a long private gravel driveway, gated, with no trespassing signs posted at intervals along the fence line that most people in the area had learned to take seriously. The house itself was unremarkable, a single-story structure that had seen better decades. But behind it, taking up most of the usable land, was a converted garage that had been extensively modified. Additional ventilation systems, reinforced walls, heavy-duty electrical upgrades, temperature and humidity controls. The kind of infrastructure that costs serious money to install and is built for a very specific purpose. Daniel Forsyth had been obsessed with large constrictor snakes since he was a teenager. He'd started small, ball pythons, corn snakes, the kinds of reptiles that adolescent enthusiasts typically begin with. But over the years, the obsession had grown, and as his access to money and overseas shipping networks expanded, so had the scope of what he was keeping. By 2007, that garage workshop housed 19 large constrictors. Pythons predominantly, Burmese pythons, reticulated pythons of varying sizes, a large scrub python of Australian origin. Some were acquired through loosely legitimate channels, others were not. And then there was Goldie. Goldie was Daniel's prized possession, and by any objective measure, she was extraordinary. A yellow phase reticulated python, sometimes called a high yellow morph, a naturally occurring genetic variation that produces a snake with dramatically vivid gold and black coloration instead of the standard brown and black patterning of wild-type animals. Yellow phase retics are rare. They are deeply prized by collectors, and a specimen of Goldie's size, 22 feet and still growing, weighing somewhere in the region of 250 pounds at her peak, would have commanded a price on the exotic animal market that would have made your eyes water. Daniel had acquired Goldie in 2002 through a contact he'd cultivated through his shipping network, a wildlife trafficker who moved high-value exotic animals through falsified import documentation, the exact kind of documentation that Daniel's position in an international freight consulting business made it relatively easy to produce. Goldie had not arrived in Tennessee through legal channels, but she had arrived, and she had thrived, and Daniel had kept her in that custom-welded enclosure in the back corner of his workshop, feeding her live prey sourced through the same underground network, letting her grow. Here's what you need to understand about reticulated pythons, because the details matter in this story. They are the longest snakes in the world. Wild specimens regularly exceed 20 feet, and animals in the 20 to 25-foot range are not uncommon. They are highly intelligent for reptiles, capable of learning routines and recognizing individual handlers. They are also, at their adult size, genuinely dangerous in a way that's easy to underestimate if you've never encountered one. A fully grown reticulated python can exert enough constriction pressure to stop blood circulation to the brain within seconds. They do not attack out of malice. They are not predatory toward humans in the way a tiger is predatory. They respond to stimuli, warmth, scent, movement, proximity. And when they decide something is prey, they act with a speed and efficiency that is, experts consistently note, almost impossible to interrupt once initiated. In captivity, large pythons are managed through strict feeding schedules and handling protocols designed to prevent them from associating human beings with food. A python that is kept properly fed, handled regularly, and maintained in appropriate conditions is generally manageable, even at large sizes. The key word is properly. A python that has been deliberately underfed, kept in a state of elevated feeding aggression for extended periods, is a different animal entirely. The feeding response becomes hypersensitized. The snake becomes reactive in ways it normally wouldn't be. Daniel Forsyth knew all of this. He'd been keeping large constrictors for 2 decades. He knew exactly what Goldie was capable of. He knew exactly what conditions would maximize the probability of a feeding event. And in the weeks leading up to September 5, 2007, investigators would later establish he had stopped feeding her. Marcus Hale, as far as anyone could determine, had no meaningful knowledge of what went on inside that garage workshop. He knew Daniel had an interest in exotic reptiles. He'd seen a photograph once, years earlier, a smaller python draped over Daniel's arm at some trade show, and Daniel had mentioned it casually. He hadn't asked follow-up questions. It hadn't seemed relevant to the business. He had no idea about the scope of the collection, no idea about the illegal acquisition network, no idea about Goldie. What Marcus did know, what he had spent the better part of a year quietly, reluctantly, meticulously coming to understand, was something far more dangerous than any snake. He knew about the money. The import-export consulting business that he and Daniel had built together had, at some point in its history, been quietly converted into something else. A vehicle. A machine for processing money that came from somewhere other than legitimate freight consulting services. Marcus had first noticed something was off in the spring of 2006. A series of invoices that didn't correspond to any client he recognized, payments received from overseas accounts for services he had no record of providing, customs documentation filed under their business credentials for shipments that didn't appear on any manifest he had access to. His initial assumption was clerical error, some kind of accounting mix-up. He raised it with Daniel casually, the way you'd raise a potential bookkeeping mistake with a colleague. Daniel had a smooth, immediate explanation. A subcontracting arrangement he hadn't fully briefed Marcus on. A client who preferred confidentiality, a documentation error that would be corrected. Marcus had accepted the explanation. He'd been busy. He'd trusted his partner. But the discrepancies didn't stop. They multiplied, and Marcus, methodical, precise, the kind of man who had built his career on understanding the details of financial documentation, began quietly keeping records, printing copies, building a parallel file. By early 2007, he'd assembled enough to know that what he was looking at was not accounting error. The pattern was too consistent, too deliberate. The shell company structures, the falsified import permit numbers, the payment routing through jurisdictions with minimal financial transparency requirements. This was money laundering, sophisticated money laundering, using the legitimacy of a real consulting business as cover. And the volume of it, the amount of money moving through these structures, was staggering. Far beyond anything their legitimate business could justify. There was also the exotic animal component, which Marcus only partially grasped at this stage, but which investigators would later fully map. Daniel had been using their import documentation infrastructure to facilitate illegal wildlife trafficking, and the cash proceeds from that trafficking were being laundered through the fake freight invoices. It was elegant, in a terrible way, one crime funding and concealing another. By the summer of 2007, Marcus had made his decision. He couldn't ignore this. He couldn't be complicit in it by staying silent. His name was on these business documents. His credentials were being used. If this unraveled, when it unraveled, he would be implicated as fully as Daniel, unless he went to the authorities first. but he was also, somewhere in a quieter part of himself, hoping that Daniel would simply agree to shut it down, walk away from it, that they could salvage the legitimate side of the business and move forward. He wasn't entirely naive. He knew there was something seriously wrong, but he hadn't yet fully accepted what Daniel was. On the evening of September 4th, 2007, Marcus sat with Renata in their kitchen after Owen had gone to bed and told her what he'd found. Not all of it. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but enough. He said he was going to meet with Daniel the following evening to confront him directly. He said if Daniel wouldn't agree to stop and cooperate with authorities, Marcus would go to the FBI himself. He had a briefcase, he told her. Everything was organized, documented. He knew what he was walking into. He told her not to worry, that it would be fine. He told her not to wait up. Renata said later, in her initial interview with investigators before her own arrest, that she'd kissed him goodbye the next morning the same as always, that she hadn't felt any particular dread, that she'd believed him when he said it would be fine. Those statements would later be proven to be lies. On the evening of September 5th, 2007, Marcus Hale drove to Daniel Forsyth's rural property carrying a briefcase containing printed financial records, annotated, organized, chronologically arranged, with his handwritten notes in the margins. He had prepared it the way he prepared everything, carefully, completely, with attention to detail. He had parked his truck outside the gate. He had walked up the gravel driveway. He had, by all reasonable reconstruction of events, gone into the workshop. He was never seen alive again. When Marcus hadn't come home by 7 the following morning, Renata tried his phone. It went to voicemail. She called 3 more times before noon. The 4th call, in the early afternoon, went directly to a deadline. The phone had been switched off. By early evening, she drove to the police station on Craft Street and filed a missing persons report. The officer who took her statement was professional but not immediately alarmed. An adult male with no mental health history, no substance abuse problems, and a known business conflict visiting a business partner and failing to come home overnight. The most frequent explanation for that scenario isn't foul play, it's voluntary absence. Marcus Hale didn't fit the profile of a man in danger, on the surface. He fit the profile of a man who might be cooling off after a confrontation, or who might have been sleeping off stress at a hotel somewhere. Renata knew better. She could feel it. But she had no evidence, not yet, and in the absence of evidence, a missing adult is not a crime. She went home to her son and waited. Detectives Claire Voss and Raymond Pelletier were assigned the case on September 8, 2007, 3 days after Marcus had last been seen. Claire Voss was 43 years old at that point, 11 years into her career with the Clarksville Police Department, and she had developed a reputation among colleagues, among prosecutors, among defense attorneys who'd faced her in court, for a quality that in police work is rarer than it sounds: patience. She did not rush conclusions. She built cases the way a carpenter builds a floor, one plank at a time, perfectly level, no gaps. She had an almost preternatural ability to notice what wasn't there, to feel the shape of an absence the way a tongue finds a missing tooth. Raymond Pelletier was 31, her partner for 4 years, and their working styles complemented each other in ways both of them had come to rely on. Where Voss was methodical and quiet, Pelletier was fast and technical. He had a background in financial crimes investigations, an ability to read balance sheets and corporate structures the way other people read novels, finding the narrative in the numbers. He was also better with databases, with digital forensics, with the increasingly technical landscape of modern financial crime. Together, they were well equipped for what this case would turn into. When they pulled the initial report and saw Renata's specific notation that Marcus had gone to meet his business partner, Daniel Forsyth, and had expressed concerns about illegal activity in their shared business, they ran Forsyth immediately. What came back was not a criminal record in any clean sense. No convictions, no charges. But there were flags, and for experienced investigators, flags speak. A 2004 complaint filed by a wildlife conservation organization alleging illegal importation of protected reptile species through falsified documentation, investigated at the federal level, closed due to insufficient evidence. A 2005 customs inquiry regarding anomalies in freight manifests associated with a consulting business listing Forsyth as a registered agent. Inquiry closed, no charges. A 2006 tip to the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency from an anonymous source claiming that a private property in Montgomery County was housing unlicensed exotic animals in violation of state regulations, tip logged and assigned, follow-up listed as pending, never completed due to resource constraints. Daniel Forsyth had been circling the attention of multiple agencies for years. He'd never been caught because no single agency had held the full picture, and because his operations were careful enough that any individual thread, pulled alone, didn't lead to anything provable. Voss and Pelletier drove to Daniel's property on the afternoon of September 9th for an informal welfare check. They called ahead. Daniel answered his phone, was friendly, suggested 4 o'clock. He was standing at the gate when they arrived, dressed casually, calm, cooperative. He shook their hands, offered them water, led them to a pair of lawn chairs near the gate rather than inviting them into the house, which was a small tell that Voss noted but didn't push on. He answered every question. Yes, Marcus had been there on the evening of September 5th. They'd had a business dispute, a disagreement about financial management decisions, nothing out of the ordinary given the complexities of running a shared business. Marcus had left around 10:30 in the evening, Daniel said, and had seemed agitated, but not in any danger. He'd assumed Marcus needed time to process. He'd expected a call within a day or two. The story was seamless. Voss asked her questions slowly, leaving gaps in the conversation the way detectives are trained to do, because most people are uncomfortable with silence and will fill it, often with things they hadn't intended to say. Daniel didn't fill the gaps. He sat with them, easy and comfortable, and waited for the next question. The garage was what Voss kept coming back to. It was visible from where they were sitting, a large structure set back from the house, with industrial ventilation clearly visible along the roofline. The kind of infrastructure that costs money and has a specific purpose. She asked about it. Daniel said it was storage for equipment and personal items. She asked if they could see inside. He smiled, said he didn't think that was necessary, and that if they had reason to believe it was relevant to their investigation, they were welcome to return with a warrant. Still pleasant. Still smiling. They drove back to the station in silence. Then Pelletier said, "He's not even nervous." Voss said, "That's what worries me." On September 10th, Renata Hale brought a cardboard box to the police station. Inside it were copies of the financial records Marcus had kept at home, the backup to the briefcase he'd taken to Daniel's property, the parallel file he'd built over 14 months of quiet, careful documentation. She said Marcus had shown it to her the night before he'd gone. She hadn't fully understood everything in it, but she'd known enough to keep it. Pelletier spent 6 hours with those documents. What he found confirmed, and then exceeded, what Renata had described. The money laundering operation was extensive. Multiple shell company layers, international payment routing through jurisdictions chosen specifically for their opacity, customs permit fraud going back at least 4 years. The falsified wildlife import documentation was woven through the financial records like a second language. Once you knew what to look for, it was everywhere. It wasn't the work of a financial genius, Pelletier later said in a recorded interview for a legal journalism podcast that covered the case. It was the work of someone who'd been careful and consistent and who'd never been seriously looked at. The architecture was logical. It made sense once you understood what it was built for. Marcus had done the work of understanding it, and I know, that's what got him killed. They had probable cause for a search warrant by September 11th. The paperwork was filed that day and approved by a judge the following morning. The search of Daniel Forsyth's property on September 12, 2007, began at 8 in the morning. Daniel was not home. He'd left, apparently, sometime the previous day. though his truck was still in the drive and his phone was going to voicemail. An alert was immediately issued. What the search team found in the garage workshop stopped them cold. The smell hit first. Industrial bleach, so concentrated it was physically painful to breathe, rolling out of the building the moment the doors were opened. One of the officers turned and walked quickly to the edge of the property and vomited, not from the smell alone, from what the smell implied. You don't clean a concrete floor with that much bleach because it was dirty. You clean it like that because you need something to be gone. Something specific. Something that would be catastrophic if it was found. The floor was spotless in a way that was wrong. No dust in the corners, no tool grease near the workbench, no trace of the biological reality of 19 large animals living in an enclosed space. It had been scrubbed, aggressively recently, and with the thoroughness of someone who understood forensic evidence. The enclosures lined the walls. 18 of them were locked, occupied by the various pythons and constrictors that would be cataloged and eventually surrendered to wildlife authorities. The 19th, the largest, in the far back corner of the workshop, a custom structure with reinforced glass panels and a welded steel frame that had clearly been built for an animal of exceptional size, was empty. The handwritten label on the empty enclosure read, Goldie. Marcus Hale's briefcase was found 40 minutes into the search, wedged behind a water heater in an adjacent room. The financial documents it had contained were gone. The briefcase itself was empty, unlatched, dusty with the fine grit of the storage room floor, as if it had been thrown there, not placed. Daniel Forsyth was found the following day, September 13th, at a motel 40 miles outside Nashville. He'd been using a prepaid card for meals and gas. When Voss and Pelletier arrived with officers to take him into custody, he was sitting on the edge of the motel bed watching television. He looked up when they came in, said, "I figured you'd find me," and reached for his jacket. He had a lawyer on the phone within the hour. Meanwhile, back in Clarksville, Detective Pelletier was knocking on the door of a farmhouse a quarter-mile down the road from Daniel's property. The owner was a 67-year-old retired postal worker named Gerald Pruitt, who'd had a string of thefts from rural properties in the area 2 years prior and had installed a motion-triggered security camera on his fence line that captured the road running past his land, which was, crucially, the only practical road to and from Daniel's property. Gerald Pruitt had 30 days of footage stored on a hard drive in his kitchen. He didn't know what was on it. He'd never had reason to look. Pelletier sat at that kitchen table with a cup of coffee Gerald made him and went through the footage methodically, night by night, working backward from September 5th. This is the kind of detail that gets lost in the retelling of complex cases, the hours of routine, tedious work that happened between the dramatic moments. Pelletier wasn't following a hunch so much as following procedure, ticking boxes, doing what you do when you've run out of more obvious leads and you need to go back to the beginning and look again more slowly. He almost didn't ask Gerald about the camera at all. He'd been about to leave when Gerald mentioned, almost as an aside, that he had it. That's how close this case came to going cold. At 2:17 a.m. on the night of September 5th, the same night Marcus Hale had driven to Daniel's property, briefcase in hand, a white aluminum-sided enclosed livestock trailer was captured on that camera, traveling away from the direction of Daniel's driveway. The image quality was adequate rather than excellent, but several details were distinguishable. The trailer was relatively new, enclosed rather than slatted, and had a small but distinct dent on the rear left corner panel. Pelletier pulled out his phone and took a photograph of Gerald Pruitt's monitor. He asked Gerald not to touch the hard drive. He called for a forensics team to retrieve it. He drove back to the station at a speed that was technically above the limit. The footage established that something had been transported away from Daniel's property in the early hours of September 6th, within hours of the meeting with Marcus. It didn't tell them what was in the trailer, but combined with the empty enclosure, the bleached floor, and the missing briefcase, it pointed in a direction that was becoming impossible to argue with. While the trailer was being traced, a process that would take several days, Voss contacted Dr. Anita Carver, a herpetologist at Vanderbilt University who was one of the country's leading experts on large constrictor biology. Voss described the case, without specifics, just the parameters, and asked a direct question: was it biologically possible for a large reticulated python to consume an adult human being? Dr. Carver's answer was measured, precise, and deeply unsettling. Yes, she said, biologically possible. Rare under normal captive conditions. Large constrictors in properly managed environments do not typically attempt to consume their handlers, but the conditions necessary to make it more likely were not complicated. A snake that had been kept underfed for an extended period, weeks potentially, would have an elevated feeding response, particularly to warm, prey-sized stimuli. An adult human, especially one who was incapacitated or immobilized in an enclosed space, would trigger that response. A 22-foot reticulated python would be more than capable of completing the constriction and consumption of an adult male. Voss asked the follow-up question she'd been building toward. If that had happened, and the snake was subsequently relocated and maintained at an elevated temperature, would there be external visual evidence? Yes, Dr. Carver said without hesitation. A significant distension of the midsection, unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The digestion process for prey of that size would take weeks, potentially 4 to 6 weeks, depending on metabolic conditions. If the snake was being kept warm, closer to 6 weeks might be optimistic. There was a pause on the call. Then Voss said, "We need to find the snake." The trailer trace came back on September 17th. It had been rented from a truck and equipment yard in Nashville. The rental had been made under a false identity using a stolen driver's license, paid with a prepaid debit card. The card trail was tortuous, but ultimately traceable. Pelletier spent 2 days on it, back through a series of purchased cards to a cash transaction at a Nashville convenience store that appeared twice in Daniel's business expense records under a falsified category. The rental period had ended on September 7th. The trailer had been returned clean. By the time investigators recovered and forensically examined it, it had been used by 2 other renters, and any primary biological evidence had been contaminated beyond utility. But the footage remained. The dent remained. The timeline remained. Goldie was found on September 19, 2007, 14 days after Marcus disappeared. The call came to the non-emergency line at 11:23 a.m. from the owner of a climate-controlled self-storage facility on the southern edge of Clarksville, approximately 12 miles from Daniel's property. He'd noticed one of his units had been remotely overriding its thermostat settings, running consistently warmer than the standard default temperature. The unit was rented under an LLC name that turned out to be defunct, paid 6 months in advance in cash with no contact information. He'd gone to check it himself that morning, heard something inside, and left quickly. He'd described the sound as a low, slow, sustained movement, like something very large shifting its weight. It's worth pausing here to appreciate how extraordinary it is that this tip came in at all. The storage facility owner had no reason to connect what he was hearing to a missing persons case. He didn't know Marcus Hale's name. He didn't know about Daniel Forsyth. He just knew that one of his units was doing something unusual with its thermostat, and that when he'd gone to investigate, the sound from inside had made every instinct he possessed tell him to back away and call someone else. He'd called the non-emergency line, not 911, because he wasn't sure it was an emergency. If he'd decided it wasn't worth reporting at all, if he'd just noted it in his maintenance log and moved on, investigators might have lost their most critical physical evidence entirely. Voss, Pelletier, Dr. Carver, and a team of officers arrived at the storage facility at 2:45 p.m. Dr. Carver had brought equipment for safe handling of large constrictors. She insisted on going in first. Goldie was in the far corner of the unit, coiled on a raised platform of artificial turf that had been placed there specifically for her. She was alive. She was warm. And her midsection, even through the climate-controlled air of the unit, even in the inadequate lighting of a storage facility, was visibly, dramatically, unmistakably distended. Dr. Carver stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking. Then she turned to Voss and said quietly, "Get the imaging team." The forensic veterinary imaging was conducted the following morning, September 20th, with portable X-ray and ultrasound equipment brought in by a team from the State Veterinary Forensic Lab. What the imaging showed was devastating and definitive. The skeletal structures visible in Goldie's digestive tract were consistent with a large adult human. The forensic report, filed October 3, 2007, confirmed the presence of human biological material. DNA analysis of recovered material matched Marcus Hale. Marcus had never left that garage. He had never walked back down that gravel driveway. He had gone in with a briefcase full of evidence and the intention of doing the right thing, and he had not come out. Daniel Forsyth was formally charged and transferred to the county detention facility on October 5, 2007. He was calm throughout the arrest. He asked to call his attorney. He said nothing to investigators without counsel present, and he maintained that composure through the arraignment, through the preliminary hearings, through every procedural step of the legal process that followed. Several people who attended the early court appearances described him as having a quality that went beyond mere stoicism. There was something almost performative about his stillness, as if he'd decided long ago how he would carry himself through this and had rehearsed it until it was second nature. The same blankness, the same quiet control that had made Claire Voss uneasy at their very first meeting was on display in the courtroom too. His defense attorney, a Nashville-based criminal defense specialist with a record of success in complex circumstantial cases, moved quickly to establish the core of what would become the defense's central argument. The evidence, while genuinely extraordinary, did not constitute definitive proof of premeditated murder. The DNA confirmation of Marcus's remains was, the defense acknowledged, not in dispute. But the specific circumstances, how exactly Marcus had died, and whether Daniel had deliberately engineered his death versus whether something had gone catastrophically wrong during a confrontation, were, the defense argued, far less clear than the prosecution was representing. Death by misadventure in an unusual environment was the phrase the defense began using in pretrial motions. The idea that Marcus's death, while clearly connected to Daniel's property and the python, might have been the result of a confrontation that escalated in ways neither party had fully anticipated. It was a creative argument, not convincing in the view of most legal observers following the case, but creative enough to introduce doubt, which is precisely what a defense attorney is supposed to do. And then the phone records arrived, and the argument became irrelevant. It happened during the broad discovery process, the kind of comprehensive subpoena of financial and communications records that characterizes complex financial crime prosecutions. Pelletier, reviewing the full communications records pulled on both Daniel and Marcus, noticed something that initially registered as a minor personal matter: a series of calls and text messages between Daniel Forsyth's personal cell phone and Renata Hale's cell phone. Not the business lines, personal phones. The calls were brief, mostly 2 minutes, sometimes 4, occasionally longer. The text threads had been deleted from both devices. Deleted doesn't mean gone. The digital forensics team recovered the texts on October 28, 2007. Pelletier read through the recovered record in a secure room at the station with Voss sitting across from him. It took them the better part of 2 hours to get through it all. When they were done, neither of them spoke for a while. What the recovered texts revealed was that Renata Hale and Daniel Forsyth had been in a romantic relationship for approximately 2 years and 3 months, a relationship that Marcus had apparently never known about. A relationship that had begun, based on the earliest recovered messages, around the same time Marcus had first started noticing financial discrepancies in the business. The timeline was not coincidental. The texts made clear that Renata had been fully aware of the money laundering operation. Not in a vague, suspecting something sense, she had been a participant in the conversations about it, offering Daniel advice on managing Marcus's growing awareness, discussing how to handle the escalating risk Marcus posed to the operation, agreeing on messaging to keep Marcus reassured and off balance. She had known. For at least 14 months before Marcus's death, She had known exactly what Daniel was doing, and she had been actively helping him protect it. And then Marcus had told her he was going to Daniel's property on the night of September 5th to confront him, and, if necessary, go to the FBI. He had sat in their kitchen, after their son had gone to bed, and told his wife, who was sleeping with his business partner, who had been helping that business partner launder money for years, that he had a briefcase full of evidence and that he intended to use it. Renata had listened. She had kissed him goodbye the next morning, and she had, at 9:14 a.m. on the morning of September 5th, 2007, sent Daniel a text message that read, "He's going tonight. He's made up his mind. It has to be tonight." Daniel's response, 8 minutes later, "I know, it's handled. Don't call me again until I tell you to." There was more. Investigators found a text exchange from April 2006 in which Daniel had described Goldie's capabilities to Renata in specific clinical detail, including the assertion that she was the most efficient way to make something disappear I've ever encountered. Renata's response had been a laughing emoji. She had understood the implication. She had found it, apparently, amusing. She had known what Daniel was capable of. She had known about Goldie, and on the morning of her husband's murder, she had given Daniel the information he needed to confirm the timing. Renata Hale had spent the 6 months since Marcus's disappearance presenting herself as a grieving widow. She had cooperated with investigators. She had appeared at press conferences organized by Marcus's family calling for justice. She had sat in the courtroom gallery at Daniel's preliminary hearings with her eyes red and her hands folded in her lap. Her son Owen had been beside her, 15 years old, watching the proceedings against the man accused of killing his father. Renata was arrested on March 22, 2008, in the parking lot of Owen's school, where she had just dropped him off for the day. She was placed in handcuffs and driven to the station while Owen was in first period, unaware. He would learn about it from a school administrator during second period, who brought him to the office and sat with him while he called his aunt, Marcus's sister Patricia. Owen Hale was 15 years old. He had lost his father to his mother's betrayal, and now he had lost his mother to the law. Both trials moved through the Tennessee court system over the following year. Daniel's trial began in August 2008. The prosecution's case was built on the DNA evidence, the recovered texts, the financial forensics, the timeline established by Gerald Pruitt's security camera footage, which was presented to the jury in detail, the white livestock trailer at 2:17 a.m. playing on a screen in the courtroom while the prosecutor walked the jury through what that image represented. The defense's misadventure argument had been fatally undermined by the recovered texts before the trial even began. The deliberate underfeeding of Goldie, established by veterinary records indicating the snake's condition at the time of her discovery, combined with the text messages sent the morning of Marcus's death, left almost no room for the argument that this had been anything other than a planned killing. Dr. Anita Carver testified for 4 hours as the prosecution's expert witness. She explained the biology of large reticulated pythons, the mechanism and speed of constriction, the evidence visible in the imaging scans, the significance of the deliberate temperature management of the storage unit, and the timeline of digestion. She was precise, authoritative, and, perhaps most importantly for the jury, deeply calm. She treated the subject with the clinical detachment of a scientist, which had the effect of making the horror of what she was describing more, not less, vivid. The jury in Daniel Forsyth's trial deliberated for 9 hours across 2 days. On November 14, 2008, they returned a unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts. Renata Hale's trial began in January 2009. Her defense team argued that her text message was ambiguous, that "it has to be tonight" could refer to the meeting itself, the confrontation, rather than a killing, and that she had not known what Daniel intended to do, only that he intended to handle the situation. It was an argument the prosecution systematically dismantled using the full text record, the timeline of the relationship, and Renata's documented knowledge of the money laundering operation. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. On February 19, 2009, they found Renata Hale guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing for Daniel Forsyth was held on April 6, 2009. The courtroom was full. Marcus's sister Patricia sat in the front row of the gallery with Marcus's elderly parents on either side of her. Owen Hale was not present. Patricia had made the decision to keep him away from both sentencing hearings, a decision she later described as one of the hardest calls she'd ever made. "He'd been through enough," she said. "He didn't need to sit in a room and watch them sentence his mother." Renata Hale's sentencing followed 3 weeks later, on April 27, 2009. Owen was still not present. Patricia attended. She read a victim impact statement to the court that lasted 11 minutes, and that several journalists in the room later described as the most quietly devastating thing they had ever heard in a courtroom. She did not shout. She did not break down. She simply described her brother, who he was, what he'd built, what his son had lost, and then she looked at Renata and said, in a voice that was steady as concrete, "You told him not to worry, and he believed you, because that's who Marcus was." In the wake of the case, several significant things changed. Tennessee enacted new exotic animal legislation in 2010, specifically addressing large constrictor snakes, tightening permit requirements, mandating annual third-party inspections of private facilities, housing reptiles over 12 feet in length, and creating a new category of criminal liability for using exotic animals as instruments of harm. The bill was introduced by a state representative who cited the Forsyth case in her floor remarks. It passed with bipartisan support and was signed into law in November 2010. It is informally known among wildlife enforcement officials in Tennessee as the Hale Act. The financial crime component of the investigation prompted a broader federal probe into the exotic animal trafficking network Daniel had been part of. Working from the contacts and documentation uncovered during the Forsyth investigation, federal agents identified and prosecuted a trafficking ring that extended across 4 states. Between 2009 and 2013, 12 additional individuals were charged in connection with the network. Several received federal prison sentences. Among the things investigators uncovered in that broader probe was the scale of the illegal exotic animal market that Daniel had been operating within. The numbers, when they were eventually compiled by federal analysts, were staggering. Millions of dollars in animal transactions annually flowing through falsified customs documentation and fake import permits, money laundered through shell companies and ghost freight invoices. The network Daniel had been part of was not a small localized operation. It was a functioning criminal enterprise with reach across multiple continents, and it had operated, largely undisturbed, for years, in part because the agencies that might have caught it had never all been looking at the same picture at the same time. It took a murdered man's meticulously organized briefcase and a storage facility owner who heard a strange sound and decided to make a phone call to finally bring it into focus. Goldie was transported to a licensed reptile sanctuary in Central Florida following the completion of the forensic investigation in the spring of 2008. The sanctuary, which operates as a nonprofit and houses confiscated and surrendered large reptiles, confirmed her arrival and has reported on her condition periodically over the years. Reticulated pythons in captivity can live 30 years or more. She would be in her mid to late 20s now by the most reasonable estimate of her age at acquisition. She remains there, as far as anyone knows, alive, unbothered, fed on schedule, by people who understand her properly, in an environment where she is not a weapon, but simply an animal living out its slow and patient life. She never knew what she did. She was not responsible for what was done with her. In a strange and genuinely difficult way, she was as much a victim of Daniel Forsyth's plans as Marcus was. Used, instrumentalized, her nature turned into a method of murder. The sanctuary staff who care for her know the history. They have said in interviews over the years that they do not hold it against her. She was a tool, one caretaker said simply, the same as a knife is a tool. The knife doesn't choose. Owen Hale was raised by Patricia in Nashville from the age of 15 onward. By all accounts, the transition was not easy. How could it have been? But Patricia was present, patient, and deeply committed to her nephew. Owen graduated from high school in 2010 in Nashville. He enrolled at the University of Tennessee, studying criminal justice, and graduated in 2014. He now works as an investigator for a nonprofit organization focused on international wildlife trafficking enforcement, work that sits at the precise intersection of the two crimes that destroyed his family. He has never given a media interview. He has not sought the spotlight that this case would have happily offered him. He just does the work, quietly, day after day, in a field he chose because of what happened to his father and because of what his father stood for. He has spoken publicly about his father exactly once, in a written statement released through the nonprofit in 2019. He did not speak about his mother. He said only that his father was a man who believed in doing the right thing even when it cost him, and that he hoped the work his organization did would mean fewer families went through what his family had been through. He signed the statement Owen Allen Hale, using his father's middle name as his own. Claire Voss retired from the Clarksville Police Department in 2018 after 22 years of service. In a profile published by a local news outlet on her last day, she was asked which case had stayed with her the longest. She thought about it for a moment. "The Hale case," she said. "Not for the unusual nature of it. I mean, yes, it was unlike anything I'd ever worked, but what stayed with me was Owen. That 15-year-old boy sitting in the courtroom gallery watching his mother get arrested. I've never been able to shake that image. I think about him every time someone tells me police work is just about solving puzzles." Raymond Pelletier was promoted to lead detective for financial crimes investigations in 2010. He holds the position to this day. Daniel Forsyth was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, money laundering, and illegal trafficking of protected wildlife species. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Renata Hale was charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, accessory to murder before the fact, obstruction of justice, and money laundering. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. She would be eligible for a parole hearing in 2044. Marcus Allen Hale was 41 years old when he was killed. He drove a used pickup truck and coached Little League and helped his neighbors move furniture without being asked. He built his career from loading docks and winter delivery routes, through patience and hard work and attention to detail, into something he was genuinely proud of. He had a son he loved and a future he'd earned. The detail that keeps coming back when you sit with this case is the briefcase, the care he'd put into it. 14 months of quiet, meticulous documentation, printing copies, annotating in his own handwriting, organizing chronologically, building the kind of file that would actually hold up, that would actually mean something when the time came to use it. He hadn't done that out of anger. He hadn't done it out of self-interest, not primarily. He'd done it because he believed that what Daniel was doing was wrong, and that people who did wrong things should be held accountable, and that the only way to make that happen was to have the evidence. He believed in the process. He believed it would work. He was right. The process did work. The evidence did matter. It just didn't protect him the way he'd hoped it would. He walked into that garage with a briefcase full of evidence and the belief that doing the right thing was worth it. He was correct. The evidence mattered. The truth came out. The people responsible were held accountable. Justice, in the fullest legal sense, was done. But Marcus didn't get to see any of it. He didn't get to watch Owen graduate. He didn't get to grow old. He paid the full price for doing what was right. And that is the part of this story that doesn't resolve neatly. No matter how the trial ends, no matter how many guilty verdicts are returned, no matter how many sentences are handed down, some things don't get better. They just become part of the story you carry forward. Rest in peace, Marcus Allen Hale. You were not forgotten.